So welcome everyone, wherever you are. So good morning, good afternoon, good night for some of you. We're very pleased to welcome you to this webinar. And as the opening remark, I will give the floor to Angela Andrade, who is the chair of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. So Angela, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clement, for the introduction. And welcome all of you to this webinar. As you know, IUCN has 7 commissions, and CEM is one of them. And today we will have a webinar that is hosted by the Commission on Ecosystem Management and the World Commission on Environmental Law. As you know, the commissions are a group of independent experts that come together in their personal capacity, and we are all volunteers working in support to the IUCN mission, the IUCN program, and the IUCN work. The Commission has currently a number of almost 2,000 members, and we are part of the group of volunteers of IUCN that is reaching the number of 1,800,000. So I believe that every day we have more and more members. CEM has also a group of about 14 thematic groups and 13 specialist groups. And this group of deep sea mining is one of our specialist groups. And today we will have a very important discussion, and I take the opportunity to welcome all of you in different parts of the world that are joining our CEM Dialogues. We started with this initiative during the pandemics when, it was very difficult for us to meet, but we are keeping this initiative of hosting these dialogues on a regular basis. And this is a very good opportunity for us to engage with our members and also promote and disseminate the work that our groups are doing. So this time we have the opportunity to host this event with the group of Deep Seabed Mining, which is a very important topic that, as you know, is the importance of this topic is increasing, and is very much aligned with the work of the Commission. You know that our mandate is very much focused on the promotion of the ecosystem approach. And as most of you may have heard, deep sea bed mining does not yet exist as an industry, but it's a theme that is attracting a lot of interest worldwide. The proponents of deep sea bed mining just had a handful of actors and are pushing hard for the activity to begin. At the same time, there is opposition to deep seabed mining because, as you know, this may affect the integrity of our seas and our these territories, and this is why this is becoming very important. And for IUCN, the topic of deep sea mining is becoming more and more relevant since 2001, I think, or sorry, 2020, when the members of the union adopted one of the most important resolutions along with this topic, that is calling for a pause or moratorium on deep seabed mining. And this is becoming quite relevant for the union. As you know, the health of our ecosystem is one of the critical topics that we have. So this resolution that was adopted in Marseille and on protection of deep oceans, ecosystems, and biodiversity through a moratorium is becoming more and more relevant these days. There was recently a meeting of the association that is dealing with this topic in Kingston, in Jamaica. And so today we will hear from our presenters very soon what are the main topics that are being discussed and what are the main elements and topics that perhaps could be an important element for the next World Conservation Congress. And it's very good for us to understand where are we at this point and what needs to be done, not only in the Commission, but also as a union, because the application of the precautionary principle is very important, the application of the ecosystem approach and other initiatives that are relevant to make sure that we are not really putting these ecosystems at risk. So I would like to with this short introduction, to give the floor to our colleagues from the Secretariat, who will be introducing our panelists for today's sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. And once again, welcome everybody. So my name is Clément Chazot and I work in the IUCN Secretariat. And today I'll be the first speaker. I'll give a very quick overview of what is IUCN and what is our work with regard to deep seabed mining. Then we will move to a presentation from Dr. Kirsten that will walk us through the science, and then we'll move to Pradeep with the final presentation on governance and latest outcome of the ISA meeting that happened over the summer and a way forward. So before opening for a quick discussion, exchanges of views, and you'll have an opportunity to take the floor if you so wish. So I will start with the first presentation. Don't hesitate to drop questions or comments in the chat, and we can address them at a later stage. So I will start sharing my screen up, and you should be able to see this. And let me just change it to the panorama. So welcome to this webinar. Just so that everybody knows what IUCN is exactly, I will provide a very quick overview. I'm sure many of you are already familiar, but let's get everybody on board. This is a representation of what IUCN is in one picture. It is quite challenging to do, so yes?
I'm sorry, we don't see a screen.
You don't see the screen. Okay, because it's saying I'm sharing the screen. Let me try again. So that should be this one. Oop. Can you see it now?
No, so I don't know if it's for like this for other participants, but I'm only seeing a black screen. No.
It says you're sharing it, but it's black. So maybe you're sharing
Yeah.
the wrong screen.
Let me try again. I'll try something else. Maybe this one. Is it sharing now?
No, still not.
Okay. Let me try something else. Let me try this one. Up. Maybe this will work now.
Yes.
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you so much. It's better with a picture, right? So the picture that you see has the various components of the union. You will see the box on the right-hand side, the blue one, which is basically our membership. So we have over 1,400 members organization within our membership. This is made up of organizations that are state members. We have NGOs, and we also have indigenous peoples organization. So really a democratic union where everybody is at the table to make decisions. Every 4 years, they meet through what we call the World Conservation Congress, and those members adopt the directions and the mandate for the middle box that you see in the middle of your screen. So this is the Secretariat that you see on the bottom, where we have 1,000 staff throughout 50 countries in the world, working in close collaborations with experts, so quite a huge number of experts, because we have 16,000 of those experts working in 7 different commissions, as mentioned by Angela. Today, we have experts working from the CEM, so Commission on Ecosystem Management Commission, but some work in different commissions, and we also have today Pradeep that also represents the World Commission on Environmental Law, or WCEL. So quite a wealth of expertise through this work that is used to influence policy decision make on the international stage to try and bring action that directly benefits people and nature. What is also special about IUCN is that it is the world's largest environmental network, and we also have a UN observer status at the General Assembly, meaning that we can meaningfully and directly interact with the United Nations and try and push the conservation agenda everywhere. So we covered this, but you can see on the screen in the middle that we have 7 thematic commissions, and we will share this presentation so you can have a look based on your various interests. IUCN has come up throughout the years with conservation tools that are widely recognized. There's a suite of flagship tools that are representing on the screen. And we can mention one of the most famous one, which is the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species to assess the risk of species extinction, down to Ecolex, which is a repository on environmental laws that is publicly available. And as mentioned, the members vote upon a program and the directions for the union, so for the Secretariat, the experts, and so on. And in the current version on the IUCN program of work, we have a section that is dedicated to the ocean specifically. So we have a vision, and then we have what we call the ocean impact targets, which dictate the work of the Secretariat. You have 3 areas of work, and to try and summarize them, the first one is on habitat and species loss. The second, so trying to prevent that, obviously. The second one will be on sustainable use of marine natural resources. And the final one will be looking at planetary stability, so how to maintain those processes that bring us the benefits from a healthy ocean. And deep sea mining really falls under all those pillars. And as mentioned by Angela, in 2021, our members voted upon this resolution, Resolution 122, which calls for the establishment of a moratorium on deep seabed mining unless and until certain conditions are met. They are laid out on your screens, but very briefly, it looks into the fact that the risk of mining needs to be comprehensively understood so that the protection can be ensured. We then need to have comprehensive baseline studies upon which building rigorous and transparent impact assessments. We need to look into the precautionary principle and polluter pays principle being fully implemented. It also encourages looking into circular economy principles before looking into deep sea mining. Decision making is another aspect that's put forward, whereby we want the public to be able to be consulted and have a voice in the decisions that are taken. And finally, looking into the governance aspect of deep sea mining to ensure its transparency, its accountability, inclusiveness, effectiveness, and the fact that it is environmentally responsible. To promote these messages, we have various avenues, and IUCN, to do that, attends the various negotiations. So you can see on the screen, IUCN delivering a statement at the International Seabed Authority. At the recent one, we uphold the need for a moratorium, as some of the conditions that we mentioned just before we feel are not met as of today. We then organize side events, as you can see on the bottom photos, either at ISA or outside ISA. We also have communication materials. We organize the podcast, which we will share a link to after this event. And finally, we produce various documents, maybe policy brief, grey literature, reflection paper that we try and share around the various fora. So this is IUCN in a nutshell, and now I'm very happy to pass the floor to Kirsten, who will walk us through the latest science with regard to deep seabed mining. So Kirsten, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now comes the challenge of sharing my screen. Can you tell me whether you see it or not? Yes, we can see it. Thank you very much. So just a quick word of introduction. My name is Kerstin Kröger. I'm a deep sea ecologist. I'm presently with the with Queen's University Belfast, but I also have a life as a marine management advisor at the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. And as that, I have been part of the UK delegation to the ISA in the last few years. So let's start in the interest of time. I will give you an overview on basically the mineral resources that are involved in deep sea mining, So in the context of international waters, so the whole presentation will apply to deep sea mining in international waters in areas beyond national jurisdiction. I will talk a little bit about the mineral resources, their metal contents, where they occur. Then I will move on to the environmental impacts that are likely to happen with deep sea mining and the scientific gaps. So our known unknowns, so to speak. And I just noticed, right. So there are mainly 3 metal types we talk about in the context of deep sea mining in international waters. And these are polymetallic nodules, cobalt-rich crusts, and polymetallic sulfides. There are other resources too, but we just focus on these 3 here. These minerals occur in all of our oceans. And this map here is a little bit old. It's from 2013. So you can see that, for instance, mineral resources on the Norwegian continental shelf, well, they're not on the map. So we're still discovering more of these deposits. The ISA has set aside specific areas which occur in the Pacific. So the main one is the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which you can see pretty much in the middle of the map. Then there are also areas in the Indian Ocean. There are areas on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the Atlantic Ocean. And at this stage, the ISA has given out 30 exploration contracts. And these contracts are mainly for nodule mining. So there are 19 contracts mainly in this Clarion-Clipperton zone. There's 7 for sulfides and 7 contracts for cobalt-rich crusts. There are no contracts for exploitation. At this stage, there's no exploitation of deep sea minerals happening in international waters, and as far as I know, also not in national waters. Let's start with polymetallic nodules. They're also called manganese nodules, but they contain more than just manganese. And these nodules, I call them the potatoes of the sea because they really do look a bit like potatoes. They occur mainly on abyssal plains in all our 3 oceans, but they mainly occur in the Pacific. You can find them between 4,000 and 6,000 meters depths. In size, they vary from a few centimeters to about 10 centimeters diameter, but can grow bigger. They occur partly in fields of very high densities, and it is those fields of nodules that might be or are of commercial interest. Because in order to make the whole mining operations commercially viable, you obviously need to have a certain amount of the resource. The main metals contained in these nodules, cobalt, nickel, copper, manganese, but also other minerals. And not all nodules are equal. They vary in the content of the different metals in them, and that depends on where these nodules grew. Just like the cobalt-rich crusts, polymetallic nodules grow very, very slowly. We're talking about probably 1 inch per million years, so that's about 2.5 centimeters. And they grow just like pearls. So they do contain an inner core, which can be a fossil shark tooth, for instance. And you can see that at the photo on the bottom right there, that there's a little core inside, and the metals, they actually precipitate out of the seawater, because seawater contains all the elements that you know from your periodic table. Nodules, as a benthic ecologist, that's what I am, have a special importance. They provide hard substrate in an otherwise soft sediment environment. So the abyssal plains are mainly soft sediment. And they also create small-scale habitat heterogeneity in an otherwise rather uniform environment. So as such, they have quite an important role to play. Cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, just like the nodules we just talked about, grow over huge, over eons of time, really. They are often associated with seamounts. They are found on knolls, on ridges, on plateau. The Central Pacific seamounts are quite rich in cobalt-rich crusts. The EZ of Norway also contains quite a lot of cobalt-rich crusts. They occur in depths from 700 to 7,000 meters. And the crusts can be up to 25 centimeters thick. They can form over, as I already said, seamounts, but they can also form pavement and coatings on pebbles and coppers. They contain mainly cobalt, nickel, copper, rare metals, and other rare earth minerals. Polymetallic sulfides or seafloor massive sulfides are associated with tectonic activities, such as around volcanoes, on mid-ocean ridges, and back arc basins. And in these areas, hydrothermal vent fields can be about 100 kilometers apart. So I think the best known examples would be those hot black smokers, as you can see on the picture on the left. The deposits can occur in different shapes. So you can have individual hydrothermal vent chimneys, or you can have mounds of, collapsed, inactive, and extinct chimneys. Polymetallic sulfides are quite different from the other two mineral resources. They occur on a much smaller scale. Nodule fields can, reach over huge areas, and also cobalt crusts. But these polymetallic sulfide deposits are much more localized. And they also form much, much faster. So a chimney can form actually in a few decades. The discovery of these vents in the associated faunal communities actually was quite, for biologists was quite a huge thing. And it led to a complete paradigm shift in our understanding of life in the ocean. Until this discovery, it was actually believed that life in the ocean is based on biomass that has been produced at the surface in the sunlit waters. And it was thought that life at the seafloor depended on whatever reached the seafloor, so whatever made its way down from the surface. But these vent systems have shown us, because these vent systems, the ecosystems, are characterized by very, very high biomass. And that biomass is not dependent on photosynthesis from the surface. It is wholly dependent on chemosynthesis. The biomass is created by bacteria utilizing the chemicals that come out of the superheated water, or come out with the superheated water. So that was a very big unknown we had no idea about at that stage. Let's move on to the environmental impact. And I know we have very little time in this talk, so this really is a stop whistle tour. No, whistle stop tour, sorry. So let's move on to the likely impacts of seabed mining. And I say likely because at this stage, the only activities occurring are actually explorative activities and the testing of prototype equipment. What we do know is that the different activities being part of the mining process, they have spread out throughout the water column, and therefore the effects will be spread out from the seafloor to the surface. And the impacts, they vary a little bit between the different minerals, but because there are some particular activities that are only valid for mining certain minerals. But overall, there are also some of the impacts that will be the same. So in all of these, for all of these mineral deposits, you mine the sediment. Whatever you mine has to be transported over several kilometers to the surface, and then it has to be processed to a certain extent on board ship. And this processing actually means you have to separate the ore from the sediment that is still attached to the ore. So let's start with what's happening at the seafloor. So at the seafloor, where the ore is collected or where the deposits are mined, a collector vehicle has to be used for this. This vehicle in itself will cause a sediment plume when it moves along the seabed. And for abyssal plains, for instance, for the Clarion-Clipperton zone, the sediment is usually described as peanut butter overlain with runny yogurt. So you can imagine if a heavy mining vehicle sits down on the sediment, comes down to the sediment, there's a huge sediment plume. As this vehicle moves along the sediment, there's also a huge sediment plume. This vehicle will either rake through the sediment to collect the nodules which lie on the sediment surface, or it will actually hoover up the uppermost, probably 10 centimeters, and will then move this mass into the basket inside the collector vehicle. This will create huge sediment plumes. These plumes affect the animals, of course, that live there. These animals live in an area that normally has very low sedimentation rates, so they are in no way adapted to this amount of sediment that out of a sudden rains on them. So these animals will be either buried, or if they're filter feeders, their filter apparatus might be clogged up. There also might be effects from the metals that will be released, the toxic effects of the metal that come up with the sediment. We might have behavioral changes due to light and noise. And we also, what for me is the biggest thing, is we have habitat removal. So the habitat will be removed. For nodules, for instance, if you remove the nodules, there's no hard substrate in that area. Without hard substrate, that component of the resident fauna has no settlement ground. So even if larvae come in, they have nowhere to settle. And that for me is quite a big issue of nodule mining. The water column is actually the biggest body, the biggest ecosystem on our planet. The volume is just absolutely mind-bogglingly big. And we know very little about this ecosystem. We know far less about it than we know about life on the seafloor or in the uppermost layers of the ocean. And this makes it even harder to assess the impacts and to monitor them. The major impact in the midwater will be probably through the sediment plumes. And there are two plumes. So there's the one originating at the seafloor that I already mentioned. And we don't know yet how far that will spread up into the water column. And then there's a second plume through the release of the wastewater. So once the ore is on board of the ship, it has to be washed. It has to be separated from the sediment. The sediment and the wastewater have to be transported back into the water. And they're not released at the surface because that would cause huge problems for photosynthesis. That water will be released further down through a release pipe. But at this stage, it has not been decided at which depths the water should be released. There might be potential oxygen depletion in the water. So where the wastewater is released, the wastewater might contain nutrients. The nutrients will have to be broken down. That will require oxygen. And these midwater layers, they usually do not contain much oxygen. So that could lead to serious oxygen depletion. There might also be mortality associated, mortality by the zooplankton, the mesopelagic fish that require the zooplankton for feeding due to increased sediment particle load. And then there's, of course, the bioaccumulation of toxic metals through the food chain. And at the surface, we might have a reduction in primary production through the shading of the uppermost water through sediment plumes that might affect the wider food web. The changes in water clarity might be affecting the behavior of surface feeding fish, but also of course, seabirds who dive into the ocean to hunt their prey. But it might also change deep diving mammals. The light pollution from the ship, now that is not specific to deep sea mining, that is for every ship, might lead to bird strike. But bird strike is not one of the big problems in that the light pollution can be mitigated fairly easily. There's an increased surface noise from the vessels. And of course, you have the usual risk of accidental discharges, ships, but also just shipping accidents. The more ships there are in a place, the more accidents are likely to happen. The main effect of these impacts, because these impacts, they have longer lasting effects, are basically a reduction in abundance, reduction in biomass of the resident fauna, also reduction in diversity on a species level, but also over on a genetic level. There might be possible extinctions and the loss of rare and highly localized species. And because we know so little about the deep sea with regards to what species is of how many of who are living there, it'll be very difficult to know when a species is extinct. There might be alterations in community structure, which then lead to alteration in trophic interactions in the food webs. So there are effects for the whole ecosystem. And we know very little at this stage about the ability of these ecosystems to recover. But in all fairness, it has to be said that these effects are common to many forms of human exploitation. The difference is that, of course, in the deep sea, that we know relatively little, and that makes it very hard to assess impacts. And let's move on to the scientific gaps. What do we know that we do not know? You can see here a list, it's a ranked list of critical scientific gaps, and this is based on a stakeholder consultation that was conducted by Diva Aman and her co-authors, and it was published in 2022. And they came up with only 15 critical scientific gaps. And I run out of time here to take you through all of these gaps, but just let's look at the first one, the environmental baselines. And that is what Clément has already mentioned as part of the ISA call for a moratorium. In order to assess impacts on a system, we need to have a fairly good understanding of the normal of the ecosystem, of who lives there, how many of them live there under normal circumstances, the factors driving the ecosystem, the functions, the services, all of that. For this, baseline knowledge really is important. And we also need to know the variability, the normal variability of the different parameters in the system. Because we need to know the range of this variability in order to know when have we overstepped the range. If parameters change to values that are outside this range, then we know that harm or serious harm has occurred. So there are many gaps that still need to be filled. There are also some fundamental questions that need to be answered in order for us to implement management to avoid serious harm to the environment. And that includes from the resilience. We have really very little understanding about the resilience of the fauna and the habitats of the deep sea. And at what level of impact does harm turn into serious harm? There's no definition of serious harm or of harm so far. What parameters can be used as indicators and therefore as a management threshold? How long does recovery take? Will recovery actually succeed? How is the monitoring best to be conducted? And what can we do to avoid and to mitigate or to compensate? And the force of the mitigation hierarchy, well, let's not even go there. I don't think that it's even possible, or we should not actually offset the damage or the harm we might be doing if deep sea mining goes ahead. What do we know? Well, we do know that the deep sea mining will cause adverse impacts, and adverse impacts is actually a concept by the FAO that was developed in the context of bottom fishing and vulnerable marine ecosystems. What we do not know is, well, we do not have enough evidence or sufficient evidence to say that deep sea mining will cause significant adverse impacts. That is the big crux. And unless we can answer this question, unless we know whether it has significant adverse impacts or not, until then, we need to ask more questions and keep researching. How long will it take to close these gaps? Well, spontaneously, I would say, how long is a piece of string? But obviously, that's not very constructive. And according to the study from Eamon and al. That I already quoted, it probably takes about a decade for each of the 3 mineral types and for each of the different mining areas to answer all those fundamental questions. And in order to answer those questions, we need a lot of funding and a lot of cooperation across regulators, the industry, state parties, scientists, and really all the stakeholders that will be required, including the populations that are actually affected by deep sea mining and that have over generations accumulated a lot of traditional knowledge. And then, of course, there are the unknowns we do not know about. And basically, one of them is the paper that Andrew Sweetman published recently on the dark oxygen. Now, at this stage, that is a hypothesis. And whether this hypothesis will be validated or not is, for me, actually not so much the point. What I found more, the importance of this paper for me lies more into that there's still fundamental processes out there of which we simply do not have a clue unless we trip over them. And with that, I close. And just in case you wondered, since I am a biologist, I couldn't help it. I had to look up the species of this wonderful little glass octopus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Very clear. I think there was already some comments. It was very well organized. I think bringing a different perspective to a talk that is given with some of the considerations that we still need to explore further. So thank you very much appreciated. I've seen 1 or 2 questions already in the chat, but I suggest that we move on and we'll go back into discussions right after, if that's okay with you. So in the interest of time, I will pass the floor now to Pradeep Singh. Pradeep, please introduce yourself and go ahead with your presentation. Thank you. Yes, it's showing. Perfect. But you're muted if you're speaking.
All right, so you should be able to see me now and hear me and see the screen.
Yeah, it's not in presentation mode though. It's just in the
should be in presentation mode now.
Now it is. Now, yes.
Right, thank you very much, Clement, and also thank you very much to CEM, WCEL, and the IUCN Secretariat for bringing us together today to discuss this important topic. My name is Pradeep Singh. I'm the co-chair with Kirsten on the Deep Seabed Mining thematic group of the IUCN CEM. I'm also deputy chair of the WCEL Ocean Law Specialist Group. So in 2 IUCN commissions, as Clement mentioned in the beginning. But my day job is I'm a fellow at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam, Germany. So picking up from where Kirsten left, I think we have a really nice connection about, what is the ISA, and this slide, or at least this chart, appeared in Kirsten's presentation about where the nodules are found or thought to be known. Their known locations are thought to be at the moment. And although this is from about a decade ago, it gives a good impression of where the resources are to be found or thought to be found. But just to recap also on what falls within areas of national jurisdiction, so the continental shelf and the extended continental shelf of coastal states, where coastal states have sovereign rights to explore and exploit these resources, as opposed to the international seabed area, which is the seabed area that lies beyond the limits of any national jurisdiction. So really, this sort of seabed space that is beyond 200 nautical miles, in some cases even a bit further out, since the continental shelf may be extended. And as you can see in the chart here, up to 350 nautical miles in some cases. Beyond that is what is known as the international seabed, or simply just the area. And I've put down some provisions from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, where Article 136 of this convention makes it very clear that the mineral resources of the international seabed area are the common heritage of humankind. What this means is that no state, no person, no actor can claim or exercise any rights over the mineral resources of the area. These mineral resources are vested in humankind as a whole, on whose behalf the International Seabed Authority shall act. And activities in the area, so exploration and exploitation activities, shall be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole, which the convention requires. And whatever proceeds that are received from exploration and exploitation activities shall be distributed equitably by the ISA. So very quick overview, that's the area of the international seabed area that we're talking about, where the International Seabed Authority has a mandate. Now, what is the International Seabed Authority, or ISA? It's an autonomous international organization established under the Convention on the Law of the Sea, with the secretariat based in Kingston, Jamaica. So if you are a state party, if you are a member state to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, you are automatically a member state to the ISA. And if you're not a member state to the convention, then you cannot be a member state to the ISA. So it's a compulsory requirement to be a state party to the convention in order to be a part of the ISA. Now, when we say the ISA, I think it's important to clarify that the ISA is the organization through which member states, so it's still, within the realm of international law, it's still the realm of where states coming together, acting through one organization, collectively organize and control exploration and exploitation activities in the area. And so how do the member states do this? And here I just wanted to give a very quick introduction of the three primary organs of the ISA. We have the Secretariat, the administrative body of the ISA. But when we say the member states, we are talking about the Assembly and the Council. So the Assembly is basically the plenary of the ISA, if you will. So as I've mentioned, all member states to the convention, all parties to the convention are automatically member states to the ISA. And since we have 169 states and the European Union that are parties to the convention, these 169 states and the EU are on the member states to the ISA. The Assembly is the supreme organ of the ISA. It's also the organ that is entrusted to exercise oversight over all other organs of the ISA. It has the powers to establish the general policies of the authority, of the International Seabed Authority, also the power to approve the budget and the spending of the authority, and it's also the assembly that approves regulations adopted by the council. Now, this might sound like, you know, it's a very powerful body, but if you look at the convention and if you look at the 1994 agreement that modified the convention, the assembly, or the powers of the assembly, is very much tied to the council, which we will look at shortly. The other role, I think important role of the assembly, is that it's the assembly that elects the states that would sit onto the council. It's also the assembly that elects the Secretary General. So, you know, really important functions that the assembly carries out, even though to a large extent, a lot of its work is basically formal. And it's the assembly only meets once per year, so only annually. Now, the council is this body of 36 states, as I mentioned, elected by the assembly. It's the executive organ of the ISA, so it's the body that takes the day-to-day decisions and really executes the mandate of the authority. The members to the council are appointed into 5 groups. So the 36 states that I've mentioned, they are appointed into 5 groups, systematically arranged. A systematic arrangement that ensures that all interest groups continue to be represented on the council. So you have a group of states that are, you know, the biggest investors in deep seabed mining in one group. You have the group of states that are the biggest exporters of minerals that would or could potentially come from deep seabed mining in one group. You also have a group for developing countries, and you have a group for equitable geographic distribution as well. So this sort of, in a way, seeks to ensure that all interest groups have a voice at the council, which, as I've mentioned, is the executive body. Among others, the powers of the council are, you know, the power to establish specific policies of the authority. It's also the council that negotiates and adopts regulations for exploration and you know, currently negotiating exploitation regulations. And although, as I've mentioned earlier, that these regulations must be approved by the assembly, the council can already, if they agree and adopt the regulations, also decide to already provisionally apply them pending the approval of the assembly. Another very important, I think, function or role of the council is that it's this body of 36 states that would consider and decide whether or not to approve individual mining applications. So, you know, an application that is made for exploration or in future exploitation activities, that is not something that goes to the assembly for consideration and approval. It's the council that decides on the individual application on whether or not it should be approved. And in this regard, and also in a lot of other, you know, sort of work within the remit of the council, the work of the council is supported by a technical body called the Legal and Technical Commission. And this is an expert body with about, I think, 41 members at the moment. And it's this body that, for instance, initially provided a draft text for the negotiations on the regulations. It's also this body that would first receive and consider and evaluate any mining application that comes in, and then make recommendations to the council on whether or not that application should be approved. And the work or the outputs that come from the Legal and Technical Commission actually carries a lot of weight in the council. And this body, the council, meets more often than the assembly, so it meets somewhere between 2 to 3 times per year. In recent years, the council met 3 times a year, but this year, for instance, it's only meeting twice. So the current state of affairs, where are we at the moment? So the ISA turned 30 this year. There was a big event to mark this occasion at the assembly meeting that just ended earlier in August. Exploration activities have been ongoing for about 2 decades now, primarily for nodules. So the regulations were adopted in the year 2000, revised later in 2013. regulations for sulfides were adopted in the year 2010 and for crusts in the year 2012. And as you can see in the map here, and Kirsten also mentioned this in her presentation, we have around 19 contracts for nodules. Most of them, I think about 17 in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. We have 7 contracts for sulfides. This will eventually be 8 because an application was just approved that was made by India at the last meeting, and a contract is now being drawn up. And then we have currently 4 contracts for cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts. And as Kerstin mentioned, no exploitation activities as of yet. So negotiations are currently ongoing with the exploitation regulations, but most of you would have heard of this invocation of what is called the 2-year rule by the Republic of Nauru, and this was invoked, this treaty provision was invoked in mid-2021. Due to time constraints, I won't be able to go through the 2-year rule discussion in detail, but I think, you know, Clement or myself, we can share a link to a webinar that the IUCN hosted, I think last year, which really, you know, goes into this topic of the 2-year rule in very great detail. But for present purposes, just very briefly, the 2-year rule is a treaty provision that allows any member state to notify the ISA that they have an intention to mine, and that gives the Council of the ISA 2 years to agree on a set of regulations to govern exploitation activities. As I mentioned, this provision was invoked in mid-2021. The deadline expired on the 9th of July last year, and so now we've entered into a situation where the deadline has passed. The 2-year rule provision goes on to say that if the council does not or is not able to adopt the regulations after the deadline, applications can still be submitted to the council for consideration, notwithstanding the fact that the regulations are not yet in place. So again, you know, the situation of unregulated mining potentially happening definitely is something that a lot of states are not comfortable about. A lot of other observers and civil society are also concerned about. And so simultaneously, shortly after the invocation of the 2-year rule, we've seen growing opposition to deep seabed mining, which was something that was raised in the welcoming remarks by Angela. So not just from the IUCN Conservation Congress in 2021, but we see also, you know, other government bodies like the European Parliament also calling for a deep seabed mining moratorium. We have now, I think, a total of 32 countries after the last meeting of the ISA, also calling for a pause or moratorium on deep seabed mining. You also have businesses and car makers that are supportive of a moratorium. And the one that I wanted to highlight is this marine expert, scientists and policy expert statements calling for a pause on deep seabed mining, which I think the numbers are now more than 800 scientists and policy experts that have basically signed on to this statement calling for a pause on deep seabed mining. Now, very quickly, moving to the last bit of the presentation, a debrief of, you know, where things are at the moment. So in terms of the council met for 10 days for 2 weeks, from the 15th to the 26th of July. So 10 days of meeting, but only 7.5 days were spent on the negotiations of the regulations. Among other things that were discussed was that there were very lengthy exchanges over the spending of the Secretariat, as well as the proposed next budget cycle for the following 2 years. This took up a lot of time at the council, but a few member states were very concerned about how spending has been conducted at the Secretariat, and this took up some time of the council meeting. Specifically on the regulations, so negotiations resumed on what is called a consolidated text, so a text with all the provisions, and I think there are about 107 or 108 regulations, but also many annexes and schedules that accompany the main regulations. We've sort of completed what is called as a first reading, but this term might be problematic because many textual proposals made by member states and also some observers were actually not included in this first draft of the consolidated text. And so quite a lot of time was also actually spent with member states sort of repeating that their textual proposals were not in this version and asked for their proposals to be included in the next version. I think one point to note is that the annexes and the schedules, which form part of the consolidated text, these annexes and schedules were not discussed. So even though we did complete a first reading of the 107 or so provisions, or at least about all of them, we did not go into the annexes and the schedule. So if you look at it from a page count perspective, I think the document itself is about 250 pages, and we are somewhere about 150 pages, since there's a lot of details that are not in the main regulations, but they are in the annexes and the schedules. So again, that's something that, when the council resumes, it will need to discuss, and perhaps only after that is completed can it be said that a first reading has been completed. I think the other point to note is that the regulations refer to a lot of standards and guidelines. I think at least 50 standards and guidelines are referenced in the regulations. And these standards and guidelines are not part of the consolidated text. But member states have already decided that it is necessary at the same time as we adopt the regulations that we adopt what is called necessary standards and guidelines. And so at the next meeting, we would also expect to have a list of the standards and guidelines that the regulations refer to, and then member states will have to discuss how do we go about negotiating the standards and guidelines, which are the technical instruments that would be the ones that actually give effect to the regulations. During the meeting, there was also a lot of thematic discussions. So on financial equalization measures, on underwater cultural heritage, a very important topic, on the topic of effective control, what relationship must there be between a mining entity and the state that sponsors the mining entity. And there were also thematic discussions on environmental impact assessments, as well as the environmental management and monitoring plans that contractors would need to submit. Finally, at the council, there was also a stock take and a discussion on the roadmap for the coming 1 year, so for the rest of 2024 to 2025. Interestingly, many states objected to having a third meeting this year. So as I said, the council has been meeting for 3 times, at least for the last 2 years, I think since 2022 and 2023. And this year it was decided that there will not be a third meeting. And so the council is now only scheduled to meet in March and July. Written comments are due by the 23rd of September. So states and observers and stakeholders have the opportunity to make textual proposals on the regulations, which will then be reflected in a revised version that is expected to come out in November. Meanwhile, intersessional work will also continue. And I think my takeaway from this is that there's still many outstanding issues that needs to be sorted out. And so we still have a very long way to go in the negotiations. Finally, the assembly met for 4 days in the last week of July. Interestingly, this was a well-attended session. As I've mentioned, the ISA had its 30th celebration, and that attracted quite a lot of attendance, but also other reasons, which I'll come to later. And very interestingly, there were a lot of strong general statements that were delivered using terms like precaution and so on, which I thought was very interesting. And I was there in 2019 when the ISA had another big celebration, the 25th anniversary. And I'm currently documenting the difference in the sort of language and the tone of the general statements that were delivered in 2019 and those statements that were delivered this year in 2024. And I can tell you that they are very different. And some very interesting observations that can be made. There are 3 really important, I think, items to highlight at the assembly meeting. First, there was a discussion on a general policy for the protection of the marine environment. This proposal was initiated by 5 countries in 2023, but they were not successful in getting it onto the agenda. So the 5 countries were Chile, Costa Rica, France, Palau, and Vanuatu. And they were not successful in getting it onto the agenda. But this year we had a fresh proposal by 9 countries. In addition to the original 5, I think we had Brazil, Germany, Ireland, and Switzerland as well supporting or sponsoring this agenda item. In the end, it was accepted as an agenda item, but when it came up for debate, due to objections from certain states, even though there was broad support on the need to discuss and develop a general policy, the Assembly was not able to take a decision, and the item was also not included in the Assembly's agenda for 2025. But watch this space, because I think definitely there is a lot of support to have this discussion, and the proponents would perhaps come back again with a new request for an agenda item discussion. But I also want to point out that this discussion to have a general policy for the protection of the marine environment is not something new. I think if you look at a technical study that was issued, and you can find this on the ISA website, based on a workshop that was held in Berlin in 2017, it became very clear that a general policy would be useful for the ISA. And it's just unfortunate now that the general policy is being used or being misunderstood due to the fact that we are in this situation that a growing number of states are opposing deep seabed mining, as opposed to the intention that the ISA must ensure the effective protection of the marine environment. The second important discussion that took place was a periodic review of the authority. Now, this is a legal requirement under the convention, under Article 154. The periodic review must occur every 5 years where the operation of the ISA will be reviewed, and any shortcomings or recommendations to improve the shortcomings should be implemented. And the only time that the ISA actually had this periodic review, despite the fact that it's a legal requirement every 5 years, was actually in 2015 to 2017. So as I mentioned, 30 years of existence, there's only been one periodic review. Now, if you follow the letter of the law, the review of the ISA, or the next review of the ISA, should have commenced somewhere in around 2023. This did not happen, and a group of member states made a proposal to discuss the commencement of the next review. Now, at the meeting, there was a debate about the appropriate timing as well as the budgetary implications, and a decision was not or the Assembly was not able to take a decision to order the commencement of the review this year, but decided to include it on the agenda with a view to commence the review next year. And finally, I think a very important agenda item that took place during this Assembly meeting, which again, as I mentioned, is perhaps one of the reasons why this particular Assembly meeting was well attended, including because we have an election this year of the Secretary General position. And here we had the candidate from Brazil, Leticia Carvalho, that contested the election and defeated the current sitting Secretary General, Michael Lodge, who was nominated by Kiribati to a total of 79 to 34 votes.
How are you?
So next year we would have a new Secretary General. And I think this is my last slide. So I'll just go very quickly because I realize I'm ahead of time. So looking forward, and I'm just looking forward to the next 6 months. As I mentioned, the council will meet in March next year. So intersessional work will resume. So we do have 6 months between now and the next meeting, but there's a lot of intersessional work. I think about 9 groups that are meeting to discuss certain themes like environmental impacts assessments, inspection and compliance, and so on. Submissions of written comments that's currently still open, and we anticipate that a revised set of regulations, the consolidated text, will be released in advance of the next council meeting. We are hearing this could be even as soon as somewhere in November. One point to note is that the new Secretary General will assume office in January 2025, and it would be interesting to see what direction the ISA takes from here on. Another thing to look out is the possible submission of a plan of work for exploitation under the 2-year rule. As I've mentioned, the sort of prescribed time or the 2-year deadline has expired, and it is technically possible for an application to be submitted. And this could happen in the next 6 months. I think the one company that has been pressing and express its desire to submit an application has mentioned that an application will be submitted initially by the end of this year, but now I hear before March next year. And this could be a very interesting development, because if an application comes in, member states, especially the members of the council, would then have to dedicate a lot of time to decide how to proceed with this application, as opposed to actually resuming the negotiations. And so the negotiations could be slowed down if an application comes in, and the discussions could go in a different direction. And finally, I expect in the next 6 months the debate to intensify. I think there's been a lot of developments in the recent months and years. So we have the BBNJ agreement and the race to ratification. So more and more countries are expected to sign and ratify this agreement, and hopefully it would come into force soon. And the BBNJ agreement could have some interaction with the work of the ISA. As mentioned, calls for moratorium are growing. The recent dark oxygen paper, I think that was mentioned. So new scientific discoveries will continue to come in and perhaps challenge our understandings or assumptions about the deep ocean and deep seabed mining. And I think finally, one point to note is environmental externalities. This is an important discussion that is now ongoing at the Council. How do we internalize the environmental costs of deep seabed mining? And this is something that would also have really significant repercussions on the negotiations. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. After the latest science, we have the latest developments at ISA and looking ahead, so very insightful. We have a couple more minutes now to have some questions and answers, debate. As this is a Zoom, people should be able to take the floor, raise their hands as they wish. As you can start thinking, yes, first of all, obviously, a round of applause to our speakers. I think it was very clear. We already had some questions in the Q&A, so as people warm up, well, I see a hand already, but we can just take a few that were already asked in the chat. So I will go back and ask them directly to our speakers. So there was one on questions regarding would deep sea mining affect marine mammals? So there was already a response that was provided, but Kirsten, I think you alluded to it in your presentation, so maybe that's something you could touch upon a little bit. And then two other comments, maybe I'll ask three and we can take the responses. So that was the first one, the impact on marine mammals. Then there was a questions on comparing the cost between land-based mining and deep sea mining. So how much do these costs differ? So do we have some answers about this? And the final one was more of a comment, but maybe Kirsten, I think it alludes to your presentation, so maybe you want to comment, was on the fact that there's one more unknowns that we could add to your long list that you already provided, was the fact that some trace elements like vanadium, uranium, polonium could be released in the mining and in the beneficiation of the deep sea ore. So I don't know if that's a comment you want to reflect upon, but Kirsten, maybe you want to take some of those questions?
If you give me time to answer them in between, I already forgot the first one. I think the first one was about marine mammals.
Yes, marine mammals and impacts.
That was a barrage of I don't know how many questions. Yes, marine mammals might be impacted. Now, I'm not a marine mammal specialist. I'm a benthic ecologist. So my knowledge on how marine mammals are impacted is or might be impacted is limited. But there is definitely a worry that the noise might impact on the marine mammals who rely obviously on sound for assessing the environment. So if the SOFA channel gets affected if noise is made at the level of where the SOFA channel sits, then that is a big problem. Otherwise, most of these mining deposits actually occur in areas that are relatively low in nutrients. So therefore, there is actually neither much fish to be expected in those areas. And without much fish, there might not be that much interest for marine mammals actually to go there, unless we really know how marine mammals utilize those areas. It's a bit tricky to say, which species will be affected, and obviously every species has different, can be affected in different ways. So for that, I know there's a person in the audience that knows much more about marine mammals, so we could either ask her or the listener has to be content with what I can contribute.
That's already a very good initial response. So thank you very much. And there are people that have been sharing information in the chat. So I think it was just a good reaction. Thank you very much. The other one was on comparing the cost between land mining and deep sea mining. So I don't know if that's something that you can respond to.
Yeah, that is a tricky one. That is, I think we all struggle with that one because we have to compare very different things. The costs, which costs are meant, the costs of simply, getting these operations off the ground, or the environmental costs, the environmental impact costs as well. So if we had an answer for that, we might not discuss this subject at all, actually. So
yes, I think that's a very good response. And actually there are some initial reflection, and there is another commission member of IUCN whose name is Professor Rashid Soumaila, who attended the last negotiations, who has done a bit of work on the economics aspect. He's looking into this. So he has published some research, which we can provide as a follow-up to this webinar. But as you mentioned, I think we are still in the very early stage, and we cannot really compare those. And as to link it to Pradeep's presentation, even just including environmental externalities is something that we cannot do at present, and it's still being discussed within the ISA. So that is something that is too early stage to have a clear answer as of present. So I think this is a very good answer that we don't know. So thank you for this. Then Pradeep, you wanted to say something, I see?
No, I just wanted to say that the numbers will be very significant because of the energy cost as well that is required. So the operational cost will be significant. I think I've seen filings by the metals company saying that, just to get things started would cost something like 10 billion, and then an annual operating cost of like something like 2 billion US dollars. So very significant amounts, but even those numbers are extremely conservative, and you have experts like Rashid Soumaila that you mentioned, but also Victor Vescovo that really questions these underlying assumptions and instead suggests that, because the environment is so harsh, that, the costs will inevitably be a lot more than it's expected. And I think Victor Vescovo cites one example of an offshore, I think, gas project that was initially thought to be, costing somewhere in the range of 10 or 11 billion is now in the range of like 54 billion as well, So, as things progress, you would learn that it's getting more and more expensive. But again, it's something that is very difficult to compare because terrestrial mining projects, they also vary in terms of how much they cost. It really depends on how deep you have to go to extract them. But again, as Kerstin mentioned, the ISA is quite a unique case because if you take into account environmental externalities, if you take into account the fact that, contractors would have to pay royalties to the ISA, that would be very significant. And I see now there's a question just coming up about restoration as well. And if we add restoration to it, at the moment, restoration is not thought to be feasible or it's thought to be extremely expensive. But if you add that factor into it, then it's just going to be a really different game. The numbers are just going to be astronomical.
Yes, thank you very much for this. Now I think turning a little bit to the governance / developments at ISA, there was a question on the infamous 2-year rule now, and asking whether any states could, submit a proposals for exploitation, not just Nauru. So is that limited to Nauru, or could anybody submit? And how is it likely that there will be a state applying for one of those exploitation licenses now that the 2-year rule has passed? So you muted, Pradeep. Sorry.
That had to happen at least once. Yes, so technically it's not Nauru that would be submitting an application. It's more likely to be a mining company with the sponsorship of perhaps Nauru that would submit an application. And it doesn't have to be a mining application that is sponsored by Nauru. It can be sponsored by any country. So it can be any applicant, it can be any country, but of course they would have to be in a position to submit an application. And at the moment, the only one, I guess, entity that is saying that they are ready and they are, wanting to submit an application is the metals company. So very likely it will be the metals company submitting an application, if at all it happens in the next 6 to 12 months with the sponsorship of Nauru. But that reminded me that I wanted to paste in the chat the link to the webinar that we had last year, specifically on the 2-year rule. I think we spoke about that for over an hour. There's a lot to talk about it, so I'll put that link in the chat right away. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Pradeep. I think there's another question on the interlinkages that there are between the ISA and the upcoming BBNJ COP once it's entered into force, and the influence on property rights in deep sea mining and the assessments of environmental impacts in the areas. So what are the linkages? Do they exist? Do we know? Too early? I think, do we have some reflection on those?
Yeah, sure. Just pasting this in the chat. So on the chat is the link to the 2-year rule webinar. So feel free to go back to that in your free time, and then if you want to learn more about the 2-year rule. On the links with BBNJ, yes, definitely that's something that we're actually putting in a lot of work now to understand. It is true that under the BBNJ agreement, that the BBNJ agreement is not supposed to undermine any existing arrangements or sectors that already exist. But equally, the argument can also be made that other sectors and other arrangements should not also undermine the objectives of the BBNJ agreement. And so I'll share a link to a recent paper called Undermining by Mining with a question mark on how deep seabed mining is being perceived in light of other international environmental law obligations, including the BBNJ agreement, but also other arrangements like the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we have now the Global Biodiversity Framework, and how the loss of biodiversity would sit with respect to obligations that are required under all these other processes. And as you may have known, and I should have mentioned this in the presentation, the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a bigger sort of treaty arrangement. I think over 190 states are members to the CBD. Even within the CBD, in a decision that was taken in December 2022, member states are also calling for a moratorium on seabed mining until the risks are better understood and we better understand the implications on the loss of biodiversity that would come from deep seabed mining. Then again, there are other things to factor in as well, like environmental impact assessments and so on under the BBNJ agreement, and how do we ensure coherence with the ISA, as well as area-based management tools like marine protected areas that we probably want to seek under the BBNJ agreement, and at the same time must ensure that seabed mining activities or other activities conducted in the vicinity do not impede on the conservation efforts that we want to take under BBNJ and elsewhere.
Thank you, Pradeep. And actually, the convergence of this international ocean regime is actually very clear now with many fora. You mentioned CBD, but there's also CMS in UNEA. It's been discussed. So there are several fora where deep sea mining is mentioned, and notably the potential impacts related to it. So yeah, definitely something to be considered. There was then a comment, I think, regarding restoration. So I can read this one. Restoration may not be as off the table as previously thought. And the person is saying this as a restoration ecologist. To be sure, the timelines are very slow relative to the shallow waters. Sorry, this is moving around. This is very tricky now. To the shallow waters and land-based settings, but the impacts shadows, sediment plumes appear to be vastly less than the maximal estimates typically used and cited. This opens up the possibility of extraction in a way that might facilitate more rapid colonization and recruitment. So I don't know if this is a comment or if, Kirsten, I see you unmuted, so I guess you have a quick reaction. Over to you.
Yeah, well, the sedimentation is only one issue, of course. And yes, for nodule mining, it has been shown that the extent of the sediment plume from the mining vehicle seems to be far more, what's the word, contained than we thought. It's not the miles and miles of billowing sediment clouds that quite often is portrayed to happen. It's far more contained, and it's more like a turbidity flow, actually. But that is only one issue. You remove the nodules, and with the removal of the nodules, the habitat for at least those hard substrates fauna, that habitat is gone. And even if there is recolonization, if there are propagules in the water, they have nothing to settle on. So the question then is, how many of the nodules do we leave behind? And at this stage, I might also like to point out there are developments, there are prototypes tested of mining vehicles for nodule mining that are actually without bottom contact. So these are basically dive robots that use, just to make a typical gesture, little claws to collect the nodules. Whether that is economically feasible remains to be seen, but I think it's a very good way forward to mitigate some of the impacts.
Thank you very much for this addition and response, Kirsten. And I think there was a response or reference from Daniel de Jonge in the chat, referring to a draft resolution, talking about the mitigation hierarchy, should it be feasible in the future, which also refers to a statement that you made in your presentation, Kirsten. And I think as IUCN in the past, we also published something explaining that as of today, the mitigation hierarchy appeared not feasible in our opinion, especially the offsetting aspects that you mentioned, Kirsten. So I think, more to explore in that regard. There was one question which maybe is on the governance aspect, and I don't know if Pradeep, you want to talk about it. It was regarding whether there was any precedent to apply regulations that have not been approved by the Assembly. So is that a possible scenario?
There is no precedent. I think we had a situation in the past only with the nodule regulations where applications were actually approved before the regulations were adopted, but that is under a special procedure that was granted to pioneer investors. So the applications were approved before the regulations were adopted, but very interestingly, and I've covered this in my studies as well, the contracts could not be signed and awarded because the regulations were not yet adopted. And the convention requires that whatever the ISA does must be done through a contract, and the contract must be in accordance with the rules, regulations, and procedures of the ISA. So technically, it would be very difficult for exploitation activities to commence in the absence of regulations, and this also means before the Assembly actually approves the regulations that the Council has already adopted. Not only is this a legal question, but I think equally, if not more importantly, it's also a political question, and states would not or do not seem inclined to allow this to happen, as we've seen in the statements that that were delivered in the Assembly this year, but also in two Council decisions that were taken in July last year, where the Council basically said that commercial exploitation should not occur in the absence of regulations. So I think, we are, in a quite an interesting position where a lot of member states will not be inclined to allow exploitation activities to commence in the absence of regulations, and there's a lot of weight or a lot of leverage in the hands of member states here, because at the council, I mentioned this body of 36 states, the regulations must be adopted by consensus, or they can only be adopted if there is consensus on the regulations. So even if there is just one objection, the regulations cannot be adopted. And since we have a growing number of states calling for a moratorium and so on, I expect that this process will be seized upon by some member states, ensuring that there are sufficient safeguards in the regulations before they are adopted.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for walking us through the complex governance. You always make it sound very clear and easy, which is no easy task. So thank you very much. Well, we're reaching the end of the hour and a half. Very dynamic, a lot of comments. Thank you very much. There was maybe some that I've missed. I've seen the comments on the content on the IUCN resolution and, the need to engage further also with the experience in the land-based mining sector. I think this is something we always open. We have been also attending negotiations at UNEP, who has been looking into the terrestrial aspects. So there may be some more cross experience there as well to further explore. So definitely looking into this. And next year, IUCN will be hosting its next World Conservation Congress, where new motions will be voted upon, and maybe members will decide to look into further aspects related to deep sea mining. So this is a space to watch, and I invite you to interact in that space if you have the capacity as Commission members or as a member of IUCN at large. So with this, I just wanted to thank our experts who provided very insightful aspects on the science and the latest science, also the unknowns, and then Pradeep, who looked into the governance aspect. We will continue working on this. As mentioned, for now, we still uphold the moratorium position and working on the various conditions that are laid forward in the resolution. And I think we're always keen to exchange, brainstorm. So if you want to be part of this, I think Kirsten, as I mentioned, she could be contacted by emails to discuss some of the restoration aspects. And I'm sure Pradeep would be happy to engage further on other issues too. So we will provide the contact details, and we hope to be able to continue these fruitful discussions.
Maybe I can share this quickly. Clément, sorry to interrupt you. But if you are interested in the topic, please join us in our thematic group on deep seabed mining. So our emails are there, Kirsten and myself. It's also on the IUCN CEM website. So please join us. I think we really intend to take the debate further. All the questions that were asked today are definitely relevant to the work that we're doing, and we would love to have you in our membership so we can have further dialogue and so on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our commissions for the great work, and we look forward to seeing all of you in future iterations and at the ISA for those attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.